All right, in that last video we did with all the menus, you heard me talk about shooting either in the stills mode or in the movie mode. Stills mode like being M on the mode dial. So what I want to do really quickly is just summarize both of them, kind of the pros and cons of each. So the first one is movie mode. It's kind of like what you see is what you get, or what you see on the monitor is what you're about to record. Because the opposite is true in when you're shooting in a stills mode like M. What you see is not going to be quite what you record. As soon as you hit that record button, you'll actually see it, but the colors can shift slightly and the contrast can shift slightly as well. The next good thing about the movie mode is you always have a correct aspect ratio. When you're in stills mode, it changes from more of a square aspect ratio to a 16 by 9 when you hit the record button. All right, another good thing about the movie mode is when you hit the C1 button to zoom in, to punch in and look at the image, it looks pretty good. It's not perfect, but it looks way better than the first zoom in function on the still side of thing. That has a very smeary kind of artifacty kind of look to it, and it doesn't look so good. So the 4x zoom, or the first zoom that you get to, looks better on movie than it does on stills. Another good thing about movie mode is when you hit the trash can or the C4 button, you can control your audio gain. You can't do that in stills. You hit the button all day long, it does nothing. The audio meters always work in movie mode. In stills mode, it's not the case. You won't see them until you hit the record button in stills mode, but with movie mode, it's always there, even when you're not recording. Clear image zoom always works in movie mode. If you're in stills mode, it works sometimes. I say sometimes because if you're shooting RAW, it will not work. If you shoot JPEG only, it will work. If you shoot RAW plus JPEG, it won't work. So it just makes it a little bit easier if you're using the clear image zoom. Movie mode, it always works. You don't even really have to think about it. Picture profiles will always work in movie mode. It will not always work in stills mode. Stills mode, if you have silent shutter turned on, you cannot access the picture profiles. You can kind of get around this. You can go in and pick your picture profile first, then turn silent shooting on, and then you can have it. But if like you're doing a wedding and you want to be very discreet, you're snapping some pictures along the way, you don't want to have any sort of shutter sound, and then you start shooting some video, you won't get access to the picture profiles, be able to change them. Time remaining, how much you have left on the card, that indicator will always be on the screen in movie mode. In stills mode, you will not see that appear until after you hit record. And the last pro or good thing about movie mode is you have more HDMI output options. For instance, if you're in stills mode, you can't even output 4K. But if you're in movie mode, you can output 4K. All right, let's talk about all the good things when you're shooting in stills mode. So the first one of my favorites, is you have up to 12.5x zoom. So if you hit the C1 button once, twice, third time, it zooms all the way into 12.5x, and it's wonderful. It's way better than the 4x or the 5x zooms that we've already talked about. So if you're really getting critical focus, there's a lot of times I will switch over to stills mode or M mode on the mode dial to just get focus, because it's a wonderful tool. You can get all the way in and the image looks really nice and clean, and you can really grab focus. You don't even need focus peaking because you can just see everything in great detail. The next thing I really like about stills mode is you'll get the distance scale. So as you move the barrel to get focus, you'll actually see it change, and it'll give you actually distant markers of where you're focusing. The next thing I don't use that much, but if you're one of those people like manual focus assist, the function where you reach for the barrel and you turn it and it punches in for you automatically, you grab focus better, you definitely have that in the stills mode. Next up is DMF focus. If you remember correctly, it's where you press the shutter halfway down, acquire focus, and then you reach for the barrel, and then you can actually fine tune the focus from there. Custom white balance is much faster in stills mode because you actually have a menu option for it. I don't know why Sony doesn't have a menu option in movie mode to do a custom white balance. So if you want to go fast and you're doing a lot of custom white balances, definitely shoot in stills mode. In stills mode, you can shoot at a lower ISO, a whole stop. So what does that mean? Many times when you forget your ND filter like me, you can actually, instead of shooting at f22, where maybe that particular lens you're using is not very sharp, you can knock it down to f16 where maybe it is sharper, and you can get a more detailed image. AF illuminator, you can definitely use that in stills mode. You can't use that in movie mode. So if you're in a dark situation and you want to acquire focus, that little light will definitely help you get there. And the final thing that's great about shooting in stills mode is you can actually shoot pictures. In movie mode, you can't shoot pictures. I don't know why Sony doesn't let us do that. Panasonic lets us do that. Canon lets us do that. Come on, Sony, let us do that as well. Not that Sony's actually watching this, but so that's kind of your breakdown of the pros and cons of each. Probably the biggest benefit shooting in stills mode is the focus methods that you have available to you, the tools that are there. Whereas shooting in movie mode is, like I said, it's more of what you see is what you record kind of thing. So if you're in a studio situation where you've got like a monitor and you're doing a whole bunch of setup and you're not recording and you're dialing in the lights and stuff like that, you want to use movie mode because you can see what's accurately going on. But if you're doing more of run and gun and focus is really important and you've got your picture styles and all that stuff set up already, then shooting in stills mode makes a lot of sense. All right, next up is exposure. Now I know you've seen me in my office for probably the last 2.5 hours talking. Don't worry, we're gonna head out into the field and you can watch me expose as we're going through the exposure chapter. But first I'm gonna have to cover some technical items with exposure in the office and then we'll head out. I think once I head out, you'll get a lot more out of that and you can watch me how I expose. Because exposure is like, it's a really subjective thing since this thing doesn't have an unlimited amount of dynamic range. And since we have to make compromises what we're exposing for, it can be a very subjective process. So watching somebody do that, I think might be helpful if you're just starting out. All right, for this part of the chapter, try to keep it more of at a beginner level. We're only going to talk about creative styles that are, I would say, they're more linear versus a log file that is like S-Log. If you don't know what S-Log is, don't worry about it. I'm going to have a separate chapter on S-Log and I'm going to show how to expose for S-Log later. I want to do this more at a beginner level. Like that chapter on S-Log is going to be a more advanced topic. So all the stuff that we're doing, if you want to follow along, we're going to be using the standard creative style. All right, many years ago I had my first camcorder. It was pretty easy because I would just flip out the screen and there would be this one menu that said exposure and I would just make it brighter, make it darker. Then I got my first Canon DSLR many years ago and I was like, okay, where's exposure? I don't see that anywhere. I see this thing called aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, but where's exposure? So if you're in that, if you're like me and you're looking for the word exposure, it's not there, except for exposure compensation, which is only stills related. So I understand where you're coming from. If you're looking for the word exposure, you don't see it. So when we change the brightness or make it brighter or darker, there's three things. There's aperture, there's the shutter speed, and there's the ISO. And all of them are mathematically interlinked, which I'm going to demonstrate later, which will really, I think, really help you. Because when I was first starting with it, I was like, well, how does this work? If I want to bring something up a stop, how does it relate to something else? And I'll demonstrate all that, and I think it'll make it a lot clearer for you if you're just starting out. All right, we're going to start with shutter speed. Shutter speed of the three is the easiest, so we're going to start there. So what is shutter speed? Shutter speed is basically the duration of how long you're allowing the light to hit the sensor. Now, if you think about it in terms of photography, this camera has an electronic shutter and a mechanical shutter. Most of the time you're going to be using the mechanical shutter, and it basically opens and closes, allows the light to come in. So if like you shot something at a 60th of a second, it will go really fast, allows the light to hit the sensor, it's good to go. In video, we're doing 24 frames per second, 60 frames per second, 120 frames per second. Well, that mechanical shutter can't go that fast. It'll just wear out. It's probably rated for, I think Sony says, 500,000 actuations. So that's how long it'll last before that mechanical shutter will probably stop working and you'd have to send it in to get replaced. On the video side of things, we can't use that. So the only thing that we have available to us is the electronic shutter. All right, like I said before, shutter speed is probably easiest because you only have to remember 4 values for the most part, one of which you'll probably use the majority of the time. So it's going to be a 50th of a second, a 60th of a second, 120th of a second, and 250th of a second. I would say 95% I'm using 50th of a second. So how did I come up with those numbers? It's pretty easy. When you look at the frame rates that are available on this camera, you have 24, 30, 60, and 120. And the rule is the 180-degree rule, which you can break, by the way, is basically you want to take those numbers and double them to get your shutter speed. So if you've gone into the camera and you say, I'm going to shoot at 24 frames per second today, well, then you're going to set your shutter speed to a 50th because we've doubled it. There's no 48, so the closest thing is 50th. If you're doing stuff for TV where you're shooting 30 frames per second, you're going to use a 60th. It's like double, perfectly double, so we can actually use that number. If you're shooting 60 frames per second, you're going to use 120th. And then if you're shooting at 120 frames per second, you're going to be shooting at 250th. So the way I understand the 180-degree rule, which was probably developed when they first made the first motion camera, is that it matches the motion blur that what your eye perceives. So if you were to speed up the shutter speed, you can get a very choppy or very staccato look, and it's not natural. It's not the way your eye normally sees it. If you slow it down, things become very smeary, and there's a lot of motion blur and everything. You might lose detail. So there are times that you would want to break the rule. For instance, many times I'll go into a place that has really cheap fluorescent lights or maybe cheap LEDs in the room, and you might have to change that from your rule, either go a third of a stop up, a third of a stop below in terms of your shutter speed. Like maybe you were shooting at 24 frames per second and you got your shutter speed set to 50th of a second. Well, then you would maybe go to a 60th and find out if there's the strobing of the lights or banding is happening if it goes away. Sometimes all you have to do is find that right frequency of the lights and move the shutter speed around just a little bit, and then you can kind of get in sync with the lights, and then you won't get that strobing or banding or that kind of flickering kind of effect that you might see in your images. Also in green screen, a lot of times I'll increase the shutter speed a little bit because a lot of times when people move their hands around and they have green behind them, the green will come between the fingers, let's say, especially if you're doing an interview and they're talking with their hands like this, and you can see through the fingers. Well, when you key it, when they move their hand, it'll be a bunch of blurry green mess. Well, if you increase your shutter speed just a little bit, it can help clean up that blurry mess. If you don't mind having just a little bit more, or a little bit less motion blur. Okay, let's demonstrate motion blur for you so you can understand what I'm talking about really quickly. I'm just going to use my hand for right now. So what I'm going to do is pass my hand across the frame as quick as I can and try to do it at the same exact speed for each one of these. So I'm going to start off at a 50th of a second, which is what I'm at right now. And then what I'll do is I'll stop it right in the middle so you can actually see how much blur is going on with my hand. Because a lot of times you'll see people talk with their hands and they can go pretty quick. And then what I'm going to do is increase the shutter speed so you can see that as well. So this is the 50th of a second. All right, now I'm at 500ths of a second. So now when I bring my hand by, you should see it's very choppy or staccato looking, and you can see almost each individual frame as I bring it through the frame. This is a 180-degree rule. You can break it. You want to get creative with it? That's great. All right, next up, let's talk about judder. People might refer to it as strobing or a stuttering effect. Best way I can describe it to you is just show you. And as you can see, it's kind of stuttering along as I pan across the horizon. This is kind of an extreme example, so just you get an idea of what I'm talking about here. So basically there's another rule here as well, and this is called the 7-second rule. And basically this is hard to do because it's backwards, from this side of the frame to this side of the frame, if I were to pan across the frame, you don't want to pan faster than 7 seconds. If you do, you can get into what's called juddering. Now, juddering is kind of related to your shutter speed, and some shutter speed and frame rate combinations work better than others. So if you're running into this situation where you're panning across the horizon and you have to do so maybe a little bit quicker than you want, and you're running into judder issues, take a look at these examples and you might be able to make some adjustments to fix that. So the first one, or before I start, the bottom one is our reference. Shot it at 24 frames per second, and I doubled the frame rate, so it's 50th of a second shutter speed. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So we've got 40th on the top. So basically I've slowed it down so there should be a little bit more motion blur, thinking it might have a smoother effect. They look pretty almost identical. Then what I've done is I've gone and slowed this down to a 30th of a second. See, thinking the same thing, but now it looks like it's getting a little bit choppier on the top. And next one up is a 15th of a second, and obviously this looks awful. So I don't think you'd ever want to slow your shutter speed down thinking that it'll actually smooth things out. Here I'm at 100th of a second, same frame rate, and it looks pretty good. It looks pretty comparable, maybe a little choppier than the bottom one. And now this is where it gets kind of choppy. I've raised the frame rate to 60, and you can see, and I've doubled it, so I'm following the rule, but it looks pretty choppy. And then here's the same thing. I'm using 30 frames per second. I'm doubling it, so I got 60 shutter speed, and that also looks pretty darn choppy. Now, there's a couple of things to consider with this. Is the refresh rate of your monitor, the monitor you're looking at, the display device, how it was transcoded, if it's coming off of Vimeo. There's a lot of variables in place here. And like I talked about, there's frame tearing, which is different than what I'm seeing here, which is this is judder. So a lot of different things playing in here. So I just want to keep that in mind. This is not an easy problem to fix sometimes, because you might look good in camera, but the time you've got it transcoded and put it up on YouTube or something, it might look different. Here is, I'm just panning across with my tripod head, because your tripod head might be not perfect either. It might have little, I don't know, might not be the smoothest thing around. I'm going as slow as I can, and you can kind of see there might be a little bit of judder in there. So what I started thinking is, that one was filmed at 24 frames per second, a 50th of a second. The next one I'm going to show you is, I thought to myself, well, what if I use the warp stabilizer? Because sometimes that can work to fix issues like this. And let me go ahead and play that for you as well. And it's the same panning, it's the same exact shot. All I've done here is I've tried to apply warp stabilizer, and as you can see, it really didn't do much. So that's pretty much judder. Things I could say is, if you're getting it, I would definitely go to 24 frames per second and a 50th of a second shutter speed, and that should give you the cleanest, I think, if you're having to pan across the horizon quickly. All right, just to recap, shutter speed really quickly, it controls two things. Obviously, it controls brightness. So the higher we go with the shutter speed number, the darker it gets. And the other thing is a creative control. Like I said before, if you want to give your film kind of an edgy look, you want to increase that shutter speed, add a little tension to it, or if you're doing like an action scene, you want to give it more of a jarring kind of look to it, then instead of doing a 50th of a second, maybe you go to an 80th or 100th of a second to give it kind of a more edgy look to it. So one thing I want to talk about is when you're shooting for slow motion. When you're over cranking the camera like 60 frames per second, or especially 120 frames per second, you're going to need a lot of light, because what happens is you double 120, you get to 2/50th of a second for your shutter. When you do that, it gets darker. So you're pretty much delegated to shooting like outside, or in the case of, let's say you're going to a high school gym and it's not lit for TV, which I've done before, it's really hard to make 120 frames per second work in that environment and slow it down in post later. I've done, on the collegiate side of things, I've done like at CU Arena, I was able to shoot there, and they do have TV lights, and there you can definitely push 120 frames per second. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. You know, when you're shooting slow motion, the amount of light that you're going to need. Of the three elements that make up exposure, ISO will probably get you in the trouble the fastest. It's definitely the one you want to watch out for, because it can get very noisy quickly if you're not exposing correctly. So this is a full frame camera. Like I said before, you want to shoot in the APS-C or Super 35 mode to get the cleanest image. So when you start getting into like ISO 3200, 6400, 12,800, you want to be shooting in the APS-C Super 35 mode for the cleanest image, because when you shoot in the full frame mode, and I know it sounds counterintuitive, it'll actually get noisier faster. Our shutter speed is pretty much set and forget. So after you've decided whether you're going to be doing slow motion or not slow motion, that's pretty much set. So that leaves ISO and your aperture. So which one do you adjust first? Well, it depends. I mean, if you're outside, it's a bright sunny day, the rule of thumb here is just get the ISO as low as you can for the best quality image. so I bring it to 100. And then you adjust your aperture or your ND filter accordingly after that. So now let's say you've, in a dark situation, you're at 3200 and your lens is wide open, which we'll talk more about later, and you still need more light. Well, then you're going to have to go crank up the ISO after you've set the aperture. So it's kind of a give and take. And I'm going to give show a lot of examples of this later towards the end of the exposure chapter. Now, if you did that exercise back in chapter 1 where I said just go out fully auto ISO, auto everything, and just go and shoot some stuff and then evaluate the footage later, you'll have noticed that the camera probably did a good job sometimes, and sometimes it didn't do a good job, and it gave you very noisy images. Sometimes it'll just pick a high f-stop number and a very high ISO, and you'll get a very grainy or noisy image. So that's why we don't want to use that all the time. Now, when you do start shooting at like ISO 3200, 6400, like 12800, you're going to notice not only are you going to get noise, but the colors are going to kind of change a little bit. They're going to become less saturated, and also your image can become a little bit less sharp because more noise is kind of muddying up the image away where you're losing detail and you're kind of losing some sharpness. If you want to help reduce the noise a little bit, what you can do, instead of shooting in 1080, you can shoot in 4K. So the noise size for the 1080 and the 4K is the same size, but what happens when you shoot for 4K and then you downscale, like I do pretty much 99% of the time, and I publish to 1080, you're taking that very large frame, squeezing it down, and what happens is that size of that noise becomes smaller as well as you bring it down in size. So you'll notice when you shoot in 4K, the noise will just be a little bit cleaner. All right, there'll be times when you shoot at the same ISO, maybe different content, you bring your computer and you'll be like, man, it looks so noisy. Why is it so noisy? And sometimes you'll look at it like, man, 12,800 looks just amazing. And I've had that experience many times. There's several different reasons. One of them I'm going to cover right now, and it's really simple. It's what's in your frame. So if you have a person against a white background with light color clothing, is always going to look better than a person with dark colored against a black background. So what's going on here? It's noise lives in the dark areas. It's that simple. So let me give you a tip here really quickly. If you are shooting a white background, and let's say your whites are at like 95 IRE, just go ahead and push them above 100. As long as it doesn't affect anything like in the person's face, go ahead and push it. And what happens when you go to encode or render out your material to the web, that white basically becomes clipped and there's really no room or a place for noise to live. So the encoder's like, oh, it's all white, I got it, it's easy for me to do that, I'll create a smaller file size. Same thing goes with this black background. Not my coat, because my coat's living at like 15, maybe 20, maybe 30 IRE. Well, that black background that's behind me, if what you do is you take it, if it's on the scope, and let's say it's at like 2 or 3 on the IRE scale, well then go ahead and crush it, bring it down below 0. And there's, again, really no place for that noise to live. It's being crushed below 0. So when you go to render it out, the renderer, or whatever you're encoding with, will say, oh, I got it, it's all completely black. I'll create a smaller file size because I know what I'm doing here. Fixing noise in post is probably one of the hardest things for your computer to do. It's CPU intensive, GPU intensive, rendering intensive, and just your time, it's time intensive because it takes longer to render, it takes longer to edit because you're dropping frames. It's just not a very good experience. I'm going to show you some things to how to avoid noise and get the cleanest image out of it. I'm even going to show you some examples that'll blow your mind that shooting at a higher ISO is actually cleaner than shooting at a lower ISO. I know it sounds weird, but I'll demonstrate some of that stuff later. So what I want to just tell you is don't think to yourself, I'll just fix it in post and add noise reduction. Yeah, you can do it, but like I said before, it's gonna ruin your creativity, it's gonna take longer, and it's just not gonna be a fun experience for you. All right, we talked about shutter speed, kind of set and forget. We've talked about ISO, try to keep it as low as possible. So that leaves aperture. Aperture is probably one of the most creative parts of setting your exposure because not only does it control brightness, but it controls your depth of field or your depth of focus, basically. So if you're just starting out, and I'm not going to go into all the math because I don't even understand all the math when you talk about f2.8 versus like f5.6. I'm not going to go into all the math involved with that because, like I said, I don't know all of it myself. But if you're just starting out and you were like me when I first started, I got my lens like, oh, f22 to f1.8. f22 must mean it's like the lens is wide open, it's really big. Well, it's not. It's quite the opposite. So if you're just starting out, let me explain really quickly. I think Silverina gave this analogy. It's quite good. Like if you think of a swimming pool, and think of it not as your traditional swimming pool, but like where little kids go, it's kind of like a zero entry pool. So as you walk in, you might be only in like 2.8 inches deep, let's say. I say 2.8 because it could be like, think of that as f2.8. It's very shallow, very shallow. And as you go all the way down to the deep end, think of that as like f22, like because maybe it's 22 feet deep. It's really deep. So it's very deep in terms of its field of focus or its depth of focus, or it's however you want to talk about it. It's has basically everything's in focus at f22, whereas the very shallow end at 2 inches in f2.8, given the distance, it might only be a couple of inches thick in terms of your depth of focus. So I'm shooting right now at f5.6, and that can give me some leeway in terms of moving in and out of this chair where I'm not going in and out of focus if I move a lot. But if I was shooting at like f1.8, f1.4, and I move just a little bit, even at this distance to the camera, I'm about maybe 5-6 feet away from the camera, I'd be going in and focus a lot. So that's why I've kept this at 5.6, because I can move around, I can do stuff, I can turn, and I'm always going to be in focus. Let's say your normal shooting distance, your average shooting distance is like, let's say 6 to 8 feet away. What I want you to do is take a measuring tape, just plop it down on the ground, pull it out about 8 feet. Then I want you to take your camera and almost put it right on the tape, maybe a little bit higher so you can see the tape as it goes out. Then I want you to do is go to about 6 feet and keep focusing until you get to about 6 feet, and then see how much is in focus and how much is out of focus. Now, this is going to be totally different if you're shooting something that's like 30 feet away, because that's going to change dramatically. Just understanding all your different lenses that you have with this simple exercise and saying, well, if I'm going to do an interview with somebody and I want to shoot at like f3.2 because I want a nice shallow depth of field, I want everything behind them out of focus, which is about as shallow as I would go. I wouldn't go to f2.8 or 1.4 if I'm shooting an interview, because the person just moves in their chair just a little bit, they're going to go in and out of focus. But it's a great exercise because you can actually see on the tape what's in focus at like f3.2 at that distance. Now if you're shooting at f1.4, it might be even smaller. So you got to understand, well, I'm shooting this person, I know they move around in their chair a lot, this is where I'm going to be. All right, before we move outside, I want to demonstrate the relationship of all the three different things that make up exposure. So I'm shooting a gray card right now. Gray cards are great for like setting your focus, you can set your white balance, and you can also set your exposure. So let's say you're about to do an interview, the CEO is going to come in a half hour. You set up a gray card, you get your focus, your white balance, and your exposure, you're good. Pretty much when that person sits down in the chair, you're going to be really, really close. You might only be like a third of a stop off. It's going to get you really close. If you expose for that 18% gray, which should be right in the middle, that person's face should look pretty good. So let's say the CEO has come in, he's sat down, and you are thinking, I'm going to do it at f4. And so you can see I got an f4, and you can see the light meter says plus or minus 0.0. So you're thinking it's good, and then all of a sudden you realize this guy's way animated, and you're like, whoa, wait a minute. I'm not going to do f4. I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. See how I just moved the f-stop from f4 to 5.6 and I went 1, 2, 3. You can see on the light meter it says -1. So it's saying, hey, wait a minute, you had it properly exposed, but now you're a whole stop too dark. So then you're thinking, okay, I'm going to have to raise the ISO because I want to leave the shutter where it's at. So I go 1, 2, 3, and you'll see, oh, look at that. I'm back to my properly exposed image. All right, now you're done with the CEO, and let's say he's the CEO of this really nice wine company. So you're thinking, okay, he talked about his Chardonnay. So we're gonna go into the tasting room. We're gonna get some B-roll of his nice Chardonnay, maybe somebody pouring it into a glass. So you take your gray card with your camera, you set it up on the bar, You get your focus, you get your white balance, you get your exposure, everything's good. You pull the gray card away, and then all of a sudden you're thinking to yourself, wait, I want to do this in slow motion because I think this will look really good at 60 frames per second, and then we're going to slow it down in post. So you go into your menu, you go from 24 frames per second where you're with the CEO, and you go to 60 frames per second. But remember, we're going to have to double that. We're going to have to make that 120th of a second for our shutter speed. So we go back in here and we go 1, 2, 3, 4. You'll notice that now our light meter, instead of being at 0, says we're at a minus 1.3. So we're 1 1/3 stops too low. So what we have to do is we have to raise our ISO. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. And you'll see that the light meter says we're at a 0.0. So we're back to where we were before. We have it properly exposed because we put the gray card away. We didn't want to bring it back out again. So this kind of demonstrates two different cases where maybe you've done something to the camera and you want to change something like by a stop, or in this case a stop and a third. You can get back there to your properly exposed image if you just know the mathematical relationship of all these, because they're all related to one another. So if you bring up the shutter speed a stop, you can change something else by a stop, either the aperture or the ISO. They're all related. All right, we have 4 different tools at our disposal to help us with exposure. There's a 5th tool, it's called blinkies. It's on the photography side of things, so I'm not really going to cover that. We've talked about the light meter. It's a kind of a luxury to be able to use a gray card every time you want to set up a shot. If you're a run and gun shooter, it's just not going to happen. It's a useful tool for that kind of stuff, but it's really hard to use if you're a run and gun shooter. So let's talk about some of the other tools we have. First one we have here is the histogram, and unfortunately I can't record the overlays like the histogram and the zebras. So I'm recording that with my GH4 back here out of frame. And also out of frame that you can't see is the Shogun. I know the Shogun has really accurate tools like waveform monitor, false color, things that this camera doesn't have. And I know for a fact that what I see on that waveform monitor matches the waveform monitor like in Resolve 12 or Premiere Pro. So I know that the Shogun is very accurate. I want to show you how the histogram is not very accurate, or maybe is giving you a false hope. Let me demonstrate. So if you know how to read a histogram, basically on the far right hand side are all your whites, far left side is all your blacks, and those spikes that you see, it's basically a distribution of pixels in the frame. So if I were to zoom out or show you more what's going on here, my wall is colored pretty much like the 18% gray card, and I did that on purpose. Just so in my office I don't have any sort of color cast. But you'll see that there's a big spike right in the middle. It's showing that a lot of pixels are right in the middle of the frame. And sure, if you look at the frame, a lot of it's gray. But if I zoom in and you look at that white patch, see that tiny little thing on the side, that white spike, and see how it's coming up? That means that there's basically more pixels in the frame on that right-hand side, that little patch. So it's showing a distribution of pixels, which can be very helpful. And it's showing us basically brightness. It's not showing us the blue channel, the red channel, the green channel. It's just showing you, I guess, all channels combined, basically. Looking at the Shogun, which I know is out of frame, I'm running out of cameras to be able to show all this stuff to you. But basically, right now, that white patch is below 100 IRE. Now, this camera records, I think, to 108 IRE. Super whites is what it's called. And you can actually go into post and bring those super whites down and recover them. So you can actually record above 100 IRE. But on my waveform monitor, it's below. It's like at 95 right now. So I'm going to bring up the ISO 1 click. And right now, that white patch is at 100 IRE. It's right at 100. It's like right even with it. And as we could see on the histogram, that white spike just moved to the right a little bit. So basically when you're clipping on the histogram, you'll see all the stuff is just stacked all the way to the right side of the histogram. That's when you know you're starting to clip. So to me, I'm like, I'm not clipping, right? So now I'm going to go one more step. And then boom, I'm up at like maybe 103, 105 right now. Zebras started to appear, which we're going to get to a little bit later here in a second. But you'll notice that white spike, it grew in size. It's taller, but it's still not stacked up against that right side. Now if I go one more stop, or a third of a stop up, now I can tell on there I'm really starting to clip on the waveform monitor on the Shogun. Here, again, it looks like there's some space between the far right side and that spike. So basically, the histogram is not very good at showing you when things are clipping, especially when we're going to go outside. I'm going to demonstrate this, especially with the blue sky. You'll think, oh, I'm good, but all of a sudden you're going to be starting to lose color in the blue, and it's going to start changing a different color. We're going to demonstrate that later. So histogram, in terms of exposure, judging whether you're clipping or not, is not the most accurate on this camera. It can give you a false hope that you're okay, and then later you'll notice you're bringing in your editing program and you're like, darn it, I've overexposed and I've lost detail. All right, next up is zebras. Zebras can be used for a lot of different things, like setting up even green screen. Most of the time what I use it for is just kind of highlight protection, understanding what in the frame is starting to clip. Like if you have somebody's face and their forehead is reflecting a lot of specular highlights, you can see zebras start to appear on their forehead, then you know you should back down. So what I usually do for zebras, remember I assigned it to this button right here, is I can actually turn this to 100 plus, and that'll tell me anything that is starting to clip. So if I go down, you can actually see it at 100, there's 95, like that white patch is totally gone. Although if I can look on the actual, on the Shogun here, it's showing it's around 95 right now. So if I go to 95, I can see that it's pretty accurate in terms of what it's showing on the waveform monitor that you can't see, unfortunately. So when I go to 100, it's losing some of it. But go to 100 plus, it's totally clean. And sure enough, I'm not going over 100 right now. So if I bring up the ISO, sorry if you can hear the wind. It's windy out there right now. And right now it's like at 99. And sure enough, you can see some of the zebras are starting to appear on that white patch. And then here I'm at like, let's say 104, maybe 105 on the waveform monitor. And yeah, it's showing. And again, like the histogram, it's not accurately showing what's going on here. But what I typically do in terms of using the zebras is once I see those starting to appear, then I know I'm getting close. I check to see what's in the frame that's important, make sure like somebody's face doesn't have that on them, and I pretty much go from there. And the fourth and final tool is probably the most important, and that's your eyes using the zoom in function. So I don't have anything right here. We'll demonstrate this a little bit better next time. But basically, if I hit the C1 button twice, I can zoom in on that white patch, or think of it like as if you're interviewing somebody, the specular highlight on their forehead. You zoom in, you can see, oh, I can see pores, then you're good. You're not losing any detail. But if let's say you don't see anything, it's just a white glob of mess and you're overexposing, then you might want to back it down a third of a stop, or until you can see detail in the person's skin. Almost ready to head outside. One last thing I want to cover, and that is contrast and how that relates to your exposure. So really quickly here, you can see I'm on standard picture style. You can see the white patch. I've got it set up to where it's just starting to clip. And what I'm going to do is start run through some of these creative styles and watch what happens to that white patch. So we're going to go to vivid. You can see, oh, it's a little bit more. We got neutral. It looks pretty good. It looks similar to standard. But we go to something like clear. Look what happened. It's just like changed the exposure a lot. So all of a sudden, the point I want to drive home here is, even if you set your exposure and then all of a sudden you start playing around with the creative styles, you can run into problems. All right, next up, we're going to do something relatively simple for the first exposure. This is a landscape. Those mountains are about maybe 6 miles away from here. So we're going to lose some of the blacks, because over distance it seems like you have less contrast. You'll also notice that this image is very dark. And I don't really like shooting this 7200 lens from Sony at f/22 or anything like that. So let's bring it down to like f/9. You'll now notice that the histogram is stacked pretty much in the center. And like I said before, we're not going to have many blacks, even though those trees should be black if we were a lot closer. We'd have some blacks. And we're also not going to have a ton of whites because, again, it's over distance, it becomes less contrasty. So this is actually somewhat of an easy scene to do. I know it's out of the frame, you can't see it, but I'm looking at my Shogun, and sure enough, the blue sky is not being above, and nothing is above 100. Now, the most thing I was kind of worried about would be kind of like the white snow in the mountains or the sky being blown out. So we have a lot of leeway here, actually. If I were to take the ND filter, and I were to go like make it dark, you can see it's starting to bunch up on the left side of the histogram as it gets darker. And now you see the histogram is starting to stretch out. Sorry for those trucks. I'm not too far off the road here. And if I start doing over here, it's starting to stack to the right. If I look at, and sure enough, right here, actually let me back it down, right here is where the sky, the brightest part of the sky is hitting 100 IRE on the Shogun. So we have got pretty much from here, and then down here we're getting kind of dark. So like what I like to do is find that spot. You see how the histogram kind of starts bunching up when I go to the right, or if I go too far left, but right in the center it kind of spreads out. That's about where I want to be for this first shot. All right, in this next shot, I'm going to demonstrate it's not all about saving the highlights, because sometimes there's highlights you just can't save. It's kind of funny, I was actually out here yesterday and there was a film crew filming a local commercial for Land Rover on this exact same spot. They were doing a crane right here, so I thought it'd be kind of fun to duplicate their shot. Anyway, so if I move the ND filter and I bring it up, you can see that the mountains are starting to they're basically starting to clip, and our bumper is clipping. So basically if I bring it all the way down to where the bumper's not clipping anymore, you got an extremely dark image. And if you try to pull this out in post and try to lift off, you know, and basically expand the signal so you can see more of the brights, it's going to look terrible. The image is going to fall apart. So what I would probably do, or I guess I am doing it right now, is I'd bring it right about here where the mountains are not clipping, and I've decided to let the bumper go. All right, here we are with the talented Hallie O'Brien, and we are setting up exposure. So one of the first things that I do, looking at the frame, we've got the zebras turned on to 100 plus, and as we can see, we're blowing out some stuff in the background. And I've got an ND filter on here, and as you can see, as I rotate the ND filter, I'm blowing out the sky, and right there you can see I'm blowing out part of her hat. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on her. What I like to usually do is look right at her face, right there. You can see, and I'll probably bring the ND filter down to about right here, and I can see I'm not blowing out her hat anymore. And if we look at the histogram, let's bring up the histogram next, and you can see as I turn the ND filter, you can see how I'm trying to protect the highlights, and there's some stuff, it's that car actually in the background. I really have no control over that, so I'd either probably reframe the shot like this and get rid of the car, so I wouldn't have to worry about that. And that is pretty much it for exposure when you're exposing somebody's face. The biggest key here is to go and zoom in, punch in, and look around to see if we're losing any detail in our skin is the biggest item. All right, I'm gonna have to give myself a hard time on that last shoot with Hallie O'Brien, because I did slightly overexpose her face. And that was the whole point of the exercise, is not to overexpose or to get the exposure correct. So I'm gonna give myself a hard time, but let me explain what I did wrong, and hopefully you won't make the same mistake. And that's one of the reasons I do this course, is I own the camera, I wanna know how to use it, so I'll run a lot of these tests and I'm like, oh, I screwed it up, let's do it again. But let me show you what I did wrong. So basically, I'm using the iPhone to record the back of the screen for zebras and peaking, because those things don't come out of the HDMI and I can't record them cleanly, or uncleanly, I guess you could say. But basically, you'll see smudges and dirt and stuff on the screen, and I apologize for that. But what's great about the iPhone is I can pan the camera around and it's always going to track the screen. But the problem is, when I look down at the screen and I couldn't hold this up to my eye, I was just judging by the screen, and sometimes I was actually looking at the iPhone. That was the bigger mistake, because I couldn't see the screen. This is kind of blocking it. So what I should have done is use something like this. This is made by Miller and Schneider. I've been reviewing this for like the last month or so. It seals my eye really well, so when I hold it up, I can actually look into it. And I should have taken a second to actually look into it, move this out of the way, put this on, and I could have looked in and said, oh, yeah, I can definitely see, blowing out part of her skin right below her hat. I noticed her lip gloss was a little bit, well, you really can't do much with the specular highlights on the lips. But what was really interesting is right here down on the chin. What would happen is she would relax her smile, the pores looked fine, but as soon as she smiled and stretched that part of her face, then I could see I was losing detail in the skin basically, and it was starting to clip. What's really interesting is I didn't really see that with the zebras, maybe because it was such a small area, and I didn't really see it on the scopes, even in post. I wasn't using the Shogun like I am here, but I didn't see that. So I should have taken the ND filter and just maybe a third of a stop brought it down the exposure, and I would have been a lot safer. So that was my mistake. I just thought I'd share that with you so you don't make the same mistake. Use something like this when you're in a very bright environment. Look through the EVF, don't use the screen. All right, next up we're gonna talk about white balance. So first off, your brain is kind of like has an on switch all the time for automatic white balance. So as you go inside, outside, fluorescent lights, candlelight, whatever, your brain is kind of neutralizing all those colors for you, so there's really no color cast. So you're perceiving it as correct. Your camera doesn't do that. In fact, it has an automatic white balance, but it sometimes doesn't work perfectly. And that's why you need tools like this and vector scopes and stuff like that to remove the color cast so it looks correct on the screen. So the other thing I want to talk about is with this camera, it's not a raw, we're not shooting raw images like you do for pictures. We're shooting more like JPEGs, where the color information, the white balance information is baked into your movie file. So we don't really, while we can change it later, you just want to be careful that you don't screw it up too badly, because if, let's say, you shot a scene way too blue and then you try to make it warmer, sometimes you can break apart, or you can have basically issues with the signal when you add too much like red or amber into the image later on. And then the other opposite is true. If you shot it way too warm and you try to cool it down, you could run into issues. So you want to get it as close as you can in camera, and have tools like this in the frame if you can, or have something in the frame like this black is also good, or a white shirt is even better when you're adjusting in post to fix those color casts. In the menu chapter, I didn't show you how to do a custom white balance, so I'm going to do that right now. So go ahead and press your white balance button wherever you have that assigned, and cursor all the way down to where you see the word set. If yours is grayed out, that means you're in movie mode and you need to be in one of the photography modes like M. Unfortunately, I don't know why Sony hasn't given that to us on the video side of things. So I've hit the select button, and then it's asking you, you see that kind of circle right there, that dark circle, not the white circle on the 18% gray card, but the dark circle. You want to either put that on something that's neutral. Now you could either put it on something white, or you could put it on something gray. Now if you have a really good light, it doesn't matter if you're white or gray. Now if you get to some of these type of lights, these fluorescents that are maybe cheaper, or have an LED that's older and doesn't render color very well, and it has some funky things going on. The reason I say that is because, like, let's say if you're doing a corporate interview, you want the skin tones to be very accurate. I wouldn't pick white, I wouldn't go for the white part of the target. I would go for the gray, because the skin tones are closer to gray, the 18% gray. So go ahead and press the select button. Now you got two sets of numbers. It can be a little confusing. The bottom number is what it's telling you it thinks is correct for this particular scene. So 5300K, the amber to blue mix is neutral, but the green to magenta mix, it's saying M2, meaning that it's adding 2 magenta, or you could think of it this way, it's subtracting 2 from green. So it's pulling out a green cast. So basically what it's saying is these cheap fluorescents have a bit of a green cast to them, which they definitely do. So what you want to do is you can cursor to the right, and you can step through all the different registers you wanted to put it in. So if you wanted to put it into register 1, let's say we're going to put in register 2. So you just hit the select button, and now your color cast should be gone, and you've done a custom white balance. If you want to go back into white balance again, you'll notice that we're in 2, and we can see that our Kelvin's 5300K, and if we cursor again, we can see we have a -2. You can see how that dot is going away from green, and it's going more towards magenta. So that's how you custom white balance. All right, next I'm going to run through all the different presets. Presets are a really fast way to get you there quickly. It's not going to be the most accurate. Like right now, I'm in custom white balance. Like I said before, I'm using these fluorescents around 5,000 Kelvin, and they have about, I'm subtracting -3 green basically. So what I'm going to do is step through these and keep an eye on my skin tones and keep an eye on, this being white and this being gray. All right, the first preset is automatic white balance. And I can just tell on the scopes that I'm looking at right here on my Shogun, which is out of frame for you, but the white and the gray are a bit off. It looks like the blue is a bit elevated, the green's even elevated more, and red is down. So this image might look a little bluish green. All right, next up, this is the daylight. And again, I'm using daylight bulbs. They're rated as daylight bulbs, but you should never use them that way. So it's probably at 5,600 Kelvin right now. And I'm looking at the scopes. It looks like the green is definitely elevated. So my skin's probably looking green. Probably the white here, gray is looking green. And the grays are also doing the same thing. You get the grays are, you're gonna see a kind of a green cast, and it's probably making my skin look kind of sickly. In shade right now, and it should look very warm, and I could see that both the red and the green channel up and the blue channel is way down, so it probably looks like a very warm, maybe slightly green image. I'm not going to run through all the different presets. I'm going to show you that this is incandescent, and as you can see, as I can see on the scopes, it's very blue. And this is what I was talking about before, is if you do an incorrect white balance and you have to later correct it. Like right now, my blue channel for the whites right now is clipping. It's well over 100. So you're going to be losing blue information basically when you try to correct it later and bring that blue down and the red up. And yeah, your image is going to fall apart when you try to grade it. So you want to get it as close as you can in camera. All right, now I switched out the lighting source. I have an LED. It's switchable between daylight and 3200 Kelvin or tungsten. And right now I have it set to tungsten. And then I went to the camera and I brought that down to 3200. I didn't take out any green or anything like that. And typically LEDs usually have a little bit of green, but I was just looking at the vector scope and it doesn't look too bad. You can see the white looks pretty white and the gray looks pretty gray. It looks very neutral basically. There's no warm cast to it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm not going to change anything on the camera. I'm just going to change the lighting source itself. I'm just going to go over and rotate it to 5600. Just for a quick comparison, now I'm in the daylight mode on the light itself, but I have not changed the camera, so you can tell I look very blue. All right, let's talk about fluorescent tube lights. So if you've done anything like in an office space, you'll probably have to deal with these. And if you ever looked up into the bays, the light bays themselves, you'll probably notice the janitor doesn't do a very good job at matching the light sources. It could be very frustrating. Well, he'll put warm fluorescence in with cool fluorescence, and therefore it becomes very hard to use one of your presets. But if the light fixtures themselves are all even, they look good, then you can tab around on the presets for the fluorescent tubes, and you usually can find one that'll work really well. There's 3 different ways to set your white balance. If you're in a hurry, you go into a room, you look up, it's like, oh, I've got tungsten. You go to your tungsten preset, it's going to be pretty darn close. You might have to do a little bit of work in post to get those colors just perfect, especially if you have something like white in the scene. You can take it and then even it out using your scopes. The second one is if, let's say, you have a lot of extra time, CEO is not arriving for a half hour, you do a custom white balance using a gray card like this, and then boom, when you come into post, it's usually perfect. And then the last one is if you're dialing it into taste, like the Kelvin. You want to maybe go a little bit warmer or a little bit cooler depending on what mood you're trying to set. And the last thing I'll tell you is maybe some advice is when you're shooting outside. I typically will leave it no matter if it's cloudy, sunny, or it's coming up to like our sunrise or sunset. I will pretty much always leave it around 5500 Kelvin and just leave it there all day long. I don't use automatic white balance outside. On the Canon cameras I used to, they were very accurate. They gave great results. But these Sony cameras, what I've found, at least my approach anyway, is I just leave it at 5500 all day long when I'm outside. Doesn't matter if it's cloudy or anything. And then if I need to, I can tweak later in post. But usually that particular look, for some reason, just works really well with these Sony cameras.